Harper's Ferry, Virginia, October 16th, 1859. John Brown, an abolitionist, someone who is against slavery, led a group of men into the town of Harper Ferry to start a fight about slavery. He felt he was being led by God to bring an end to slavery in the United States. 17 people died, including one of Brown's sons. Brown was a symbol of hate to some, and to others, he was a freedom fighter. He stated,
"I have only a short time to live, only one death to die, and I will die fighting for this cause."
The fighting only lasted a few days, and eventually the US Army came in, captured him. He was then tried and executed. The southern states were furious. Mississippian and Congressman Reuben Davis stated that this gave reason to leave the United States.
Even if it rushes us into a sea of blood.
The divided nature within the United States was a clear sign of the divided nature of the attitudes towards slavery. Brown and his actions clearly illustrate the difficulties and divisiveness and the grey area of what a terrorist is and what a freedom fighter is. Is terrorism simply a case of it being in the eye of the beholder? And this topic of terrorism continues to come up to this very day. I'll set out a few examples of it later on, of where you see that grey area in the modern era, but it was interesting to see this come up with Michael from Novora TV taking on Jacob Rees Mogg, who we'll also dissect a little bit later on, because this man's use of definitions and terminology and changing of the truth is pretty horrific. Whilst it's also important to note that even the United Nations, even the US government, struggles to find definitions as to what a terrorist is. Broadly speaking though, terrorism can be considered as the use of violence or the threat of violence in the pursuit of political, religious, ideological or social objectives. Is that vague though? Let's go back to the clip of the debate between Mogg and Michael over whether or not Hamas is a terrorist organisation.
Talking Hamas, we're agreed on that. So my disagreement with you, maybe we could have saved a lot of time here. Because my disagreement with you here is not that Hamas are bad. Hamas are bad.
Good.
My disagreement with you here.
And Hamas are terrorists. Yes, you're willing to say that. You're not like the BBC.
Well,
are you willing to say they're terrorists?
I mean, this was an act of terrorism, but they are. I think there are differences between saying. I mean,
so you're not willing to say they're terrorists?
Well, I don't really care whether we call them terrorists. What I care about? No, let me say what I care about.
BBC says this is a value judgment.
After the frankly disgusting actions that took place in Israel from Hamas, it's hard not to say they aren't a terrorist organisation. But again, we get into that problem of definition not being there. And that Mogg doesn't even attempt to give a definition as to what terrorism is and tries to pin Michael down on it is abhorrent. The acts themselves are disgusting. They shouldn't have happened, and it's all for the worse for the region. For me, I don't want to see anyone die. And having these arguments as to whether or not one group is a terrorist or not doesn't particularly help the matter. It doesn't come to any solution. But Mogg seems quite gleeful in trying to pin down Michael on a fact or a terminology that is almost undefinable. And what I would have really liked to have seen is someone pinning Mogg down to define what a terrorist is. But then on top of that, going, well, if you're going to say this group is a terrorist, do you consider that group to be a terrorist? Who else would you consider to be a terrorist? And I'll cite some examples. We could start to push a direction towards the CIA, for example. Are they a terrorist organisation, which is view of the many? Or are they some sort of stalwart defender of democracy? Well, have a listen to this former head of the CIA.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians, we
don't do that now, though? We don't mess around other people's elections, Jim?
His reference to Italy is getting interference inside the Italian elections immediately after World War II because they didn't want a communist government being elected. In terms of Greece, it's backing a dictatorship, a military junta that was in power for 7 years because it's better to have them than communists. Here's a CIA agent frankly discussing what they used to get up to.
They undertake to run operations in every corner of the globe. They also undertook the license of operating just totally above and beyond U.S. laws. They had a license, if you will, to kill, but also they took that to a license to smuggle drugs, a license to do all kinds of things to other people in other societies in violation of international law, our law, and every principle of nations working together for a healthier and more peaceful world. We manipulated and organized the overthrow of functioning constitutional democracies in other countries.
For example, Iran. Documents released in 2013 showed Churchill conspiring with the CIA in order to get rid of the democratically elected government of Iran because they didn't like the socialist policies such as the nationalization of oil, and therefore it meant that Iran needed to have a change of regime, and it was better to put in a dictator, someone that was easy to control. So how does this connect to what I'm saying? Again, you're never going to hear someone like Jacob Rees Mogg actually come out and criticize the CIA. He's a member of government. We also have an interesting scenario where, in a very weird and twisted speech, Mogg comes out almost defending, celebrating that Donald Trump, a potential next president of the United States, despite the fact he's just been convicted as a sex offender. Mogg focuses on the charges being dropped instead of the fact an horrific charge has been placed on a former president of the United States with the potential to get a second term.
The jury, deliberating in the rape trial of Donald Trump, has found the former US president not guilty of the rape charges made against him. The civil lawsuit was brought by writer E. Jean Carroll, who accused Mr. Trump of raping her in a Manhattan department store in the 1990s. The verdict was returned as not guilty on rape charges. However, it did find that he sexually abused her. The ex-president was also found to have defamed Miss Carroll in a Truth Social post in 2022. The jury has awarded Miss Carroll $20,000 in punitive damages for battery claims against Mr. Trump, along with $2.7 million in compensatory damages for defamation by Mr. Trump. The total amount of damages awarded to Miss Carroll is $5 million, so that's about £4 million. Is your value such that you call Hamas a terrorist organisation?
So my values are this. No parties in a conflict should commit war crimes. Now, a war crime...
Are they terrorists?
No party in a conflict should commit war crimes. I don't really care if we call them terrorists or militants.
Well,
but
I'm therefore willing to call them terrorists. Will you say, let's conclude on this, Hamas are terrorists? Are you willing to say that?
I think Hamas committed an act of terrorism.
OK, but you're not willing to say they're terrorists.
This is
That's brilliant. Debate. He won't say it. Thank you very much for joining me. As always, you're a very welcome guest, Michael.
The problem I have is that the language being used doesn't help to solve any issue. It continues it. Because in the words of Marina Perkis, they need their culture wars.
People like you and your party in government, they desperately need them to exist because what else are you going to win the next election on?
And to further emphasise that point, there was an article in news organisation NPR claiming that in June 2023, 20 Palestinian Americans had been attacked by Jewish settlers. But note the caveat, the Jewish settlers were calling to avenge for the deaths of 4 Israelis. The process continues, the process escalates, and it doesn't seem to be an end to it. But stoking this problem is the right-wing media, led by people like Jacob Rees Mogg, who are more interested in having definitions that are pretty difficult to actually nail down, to describe a group that have done horrific actions, yet not getting to the crux of the problem, which is that both sides, from either side of the perspective, seem to be in the wrong, and no one's coming up with a clear solution of how to resolve this. And as Gandhi put it, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And we see that blindness furthered by someone like Jacob Rees Mogg, who will quite happily come out and criticise one group, but when another group that he's allied to or likes does similar actions, he totally ignores them. And you will never ever hear a criticism like that from Jacob Rees Mogg. What I found equally galling was the fact that Mogg went into an attack on the BBC.
Yes, you're willing to say that. You're not like the BBC.
You're once again stoking a culture war, because again, you will not hear Mogg bring up historical facts, such as the fact that the BBC refused to call Nelson Mandela a terrorist, unlike members of Thatcher's government. And there are some examples of Thatcher as well, calling Mandela's party terrorists. The BBC is stuck to its guns because of the historical context, and it's looking back at history of previous events and going, it's probably best not to try and take sides. It's probably best to either stay neutral or bring someone on who has one view and play the devil's advocate. Even during World War II, the BBC didn't say that Nazi Germany was evil, but they did call them the enemy. On a final note, I hope some peace can be brought at some point in the near future. I do not want to see any more deaths. And on that note, thank you very much to all my patrons and subscribers. You really keep this channel going and growing. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.